Now, there we go. The handout is available online to download. I have put the URL in the chat. And let's see, I think that's all the housekeeping-y stuff. So I am excited to welcome Melissa Barker as a speaker again. She is the archive lady. She lives, eats, breathes archives and all the cool things you can find in them. Today, she will be talking about loose papers, those little bits and pieces that aren't actually the records, but talk about the records and have other information about the records. And they can be helpful in our genealogy also. Susan, what are you doing with your screen? It's very weird to look at. I'm gonna turn off your camera, Susan, only because that's very distracting for me. How do I do that? Oh, there we go. There. Sorry. If you are still have your mic open, I think the only one is Pearl. Pearl, I'm gonna go ahead and mute yourself just in case some noise shows up in the background. And I think that's well, here, I'll mute you. Blink, you're muted. I think that's all I need to say, so I'm gonna let Melissa take it away. Go for it, Melissa.
Well, thank you, Janice. Thank you for everyone who's here today. While I'm talking, I'm going to get my presentation up and going. We are going to talk about loose records today. No, I got to move this out of the way. And yes, I am extremely passionate about archives. For those who don't know, I've been a genealogist for 34 years. And I was a genealogist for 20 years before I went back to school at the age of 42 to become an archivist, my county archivist. And it was very interesting going from being a genealogist and working in archives, researching in archives, to working in archives and working with genealogists. I've learned a lot over the last 13 years about genealogists, even though I have been one. And one of the things that I've learned about genealogists, and it's still true today, Janice and Linda and I were just talking about it, our genealogists are sticking their noses in those computers and just not getting them out. We have got to go to the archives. If you can't travel, don't worry, you can still do this. I live in the state of Tennessee. All of my ancestors are from West Virginia, Virginia, Ohio, and all points north. And I have been doing my distance research for 34 years, and I have been extremely successful. So don't think traveling can hinder you. The main thing is that we've got to go where the records are. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, loose records. If you ever go to an archive, you're not going to see a box or a filing cabinet or a room that's labeled loose records. But the records I'm going to talk about today are considered in the archives profession loose records. And so what are loose records? We're going to talk about that. First, we're going to talk about an archive. Those of you who have been to my presentations are probably thinking, well, Melissa, you always do this in your presentations. It's because there's going to be those few genealogists that are going to go, oh, that's an archive. Oh, they have records. So this one's a little shorter than most, but if you want to go get you a cup of coffee or a drink of water because you've seen this, I completely understand. Just get back here pretty quick. So what is an archive? An archive is a place, as a building where they have records, where they're preserving them and making them available to researchers. Now, an archive can be literally anywhere, and believe me, there are archives for everything. A word archive may not be on the building, and it may not be on the title of the organization, such as this. This is the Polk County, Tennessee Historical Association. Now, they have a sign out front, but if you were to drive by this place, you'd never think of it as being an archive because it looks like a house. And so this is what I want genealogists to understand. We've got to go where the records are. An archive may be a building with the library, the museum, or other repository that may be connected to one of the things that we think of, such as this. This is a library in Dickson County, Tennessee. This is where I grew up. And inside of this library, they have a whole genealogy room. And so this is why, you may think, well, it's the library, but they have a whole genealogy room inside. So this is what we need to be looking for. An archive could be the back room of a museum. Museums have exhibits and displays, but did you know their back rooms look just like any other archive? Shelves full of boxes full of records. So the Williamson County, Tennessee Archives and Museum, one of my favorite museums actually, is in archives, but they also have museums. And here's a couple of their exhibits at their museums, one of my favorite museums to go to. They kind of do some really great exhibits where they do certain eras or certain subject matters. So they have some great exhibits and display. Oh, and if you're into militaria, they have a whole room of militaria with weapons and uniforms and all kinds of great things. But this is what it looks like in their back rooms, just like any other archive: records and boxes and shelves. So, what are loose records compared to bound volumes? Okay, bound volumes are those volumes, those big heavy books that they will bring to you to look in for marriage records, will books, court records, deed books. Those are the bound volumes. But did you know that almost all of those that I just listed have loose records associated with them? These are not records that are in the bound volumes. This is not even information that is in the bound volumes. So that's what we're talking about. This particular book here is the Circuit Court bound volume from number 1, 1871 to 1875. We know what these books are. When we go to an archival library or any kind of a place where we look at records, a lot of times we're brought these great big huge books. Or if we're lucky enough, we're pulling them off the shelves ourselves and we know how heavy they are. And they contain great information. But you need to remember that what's in these books is not the end all to be all. So bound volumes have got records and information that is recorded in these large volumes. Many of these bound volumes have been microfilmed. Believe it or not, they're one of the first ones that got microfilmed back in the day. And they are pretty much one of the first ones that have gotten digitized, which is good for us. But again, they don't contain the full story. And also, these bound volumes may not contain all of the information about a particular event. We're going to talk about that. If you find information, a court case, a probate case, a marriage record, something in a bound volume, don't stop there and think you've got everything. We're going to look for those other records that are going to tell you more about what you found in the bound volume. So here's a little story from when, this is from years ago. This is in our archives. One of the things that I do, and I encourage genealogists to do all the time, is when we went through all of our bound volumes, I have kind of a, a little hobby that I do. I like to go through books and see what has been stuck inside of them. People love to stick things in books, and I've actually been known to go to the library and just walk down the aisles and look at the top of the books. And if I see like there's something inside there, I'll pull it and see what's been stuck in there. I don't know. It's just something I like to do. So when we were cataloging all of our bound volumes at the archives and museum, I thumbed through every single volume just to see what had been stuck in there. This one day I was going through this particular volume. It was dated in the 1870s. Don't you love all the handwriting? And there was this piece of paper. Look in this picture where the red arrow is pointing to. Very unassuming piece of paper. It was like a half piece of paper that was torn off of a larger sheet. And it was folded like this and just stuck in this book. So when I opened it, this is what it was, written in pencil, no less. And it's dated April the 2nd, 1873. I'm not going to read this to you. The spelling is absolutely horrible. But it's a little note to the circuit court asking them to send out subpoenas for something. And it is signed John Henson. You'd have to live in this area to know the significance of this particular note, this particular person who signed this note, but I'll tell you about it. When I saw John Henson, I immediately thought to myself, is this the John Henson? Those of you with Civil War buffs might know who he is. And so I thought, is this the John Henson? And here in the South, he is also known as Jack Henson. And when I found this note, I recently had just attended a book signing by a gentleman who had written a book about him called One Man's War. So I took and I scanned this document. I sent it to the author because I figure he probably has examples of his handwriting because I wanted to verify this was written by him and written by the Jack Henson because there were several Hensons in our area. And he wrote back and he says, yes, this is the Jack Henson. And I was very excited. it's very exciting because he had become part of our county by the sheer fact of our county was formed in 1873. He didn't move here. His property was already in the county boundaries when the county was formed in 1871. So who was Jack Henson? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but here's a picture of him. He was an infamous Civil War sniper. And there was a book about him called One Man's War, written by Colonel Tom McKinney. And for us to find a document in a book like that written by him was pretty significant for our little area and for the history of our little area. So that's just a little nice story about something stuck in a book. So loose records. What are loose records? We've talked about what the bound volumes are. We pretty much know what those are. So what are loose records? Of course, records and information not found in the bound volumes. Again, remember, if you found information in a bound volume, don't stop there. Don't think that you have it all, because you may not. Most likely you don't. Very few loose records have been microfilmed or digitized or online. Now, with that said, I will say that there are some online. When I say some, it is minuscule. I have seen on Family Search a few collections that are considered loose records that are on there. I have seen some archives digitize some of their smaller collections of loose records and put them on their websites. But for the most part, these records are not microfilm digitized or online anywhere. What does that tell us? They are sitting in archives. We've got to use these archives and find these records. The reason that they're not microfilm digitized or online is because they're very labor intensive. They are literally file folders full of all kinds of sizes of pieces of paper. And we don't use feeder scanners in the archives. They are forbidden. So what we have to do is we have to scan each piece of paper one at a time. So you can see how that would be very laborious. So these loose records are going to be found in different ways. They may be tri-folded and tucked inside little envelopes, or they could already have been what I call processed, taken out of those envelopes, flattened and put in file folders. And so we need to be looking for these. But one thing is definitely true. They're a gold mine, an absolute gold mine, and one that I find genealogists either don't know about, they're intimidated by, or they just don't know how to navigate them or how to find them or what to do with them. But don't discount them. You really need to be looking for them. So what kind of loose records are out there? And this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about vertical files. They are a type of loose record. We'll talk more in depth about that. Absolutely manuscript collections. People who have heard me speak know that I'm very passionate about manuscript collections. I won't go into a lot of detail here because we're going to go into more detail in a minute. Loose marriage records. We find marriage records, marriage bonds, marriage certificates, marriage returns in the bound volumes. But did you know that there could be loose marriage records associated with those bound volumes? And there are. Probate records. This is probably the one loose record collection that genealogists know about. They may not know them as loose records, but they know about them and they'll do research in them. But I find that if they find the information in a bound volume, in a probate docket book or something, they'll stop there. They won't go look for anything else. And so there is much more that can be out there. Court records. Court records, yes, you can find the case in the bound volume. But did you know that that case in that bound volume is usually a synopsis, a shorter version, and the rest of the story is actually in these loose records? So let's start with vertical files. Vertical files are some of my favorite records to do research in as a genealogist. I have found a lot of great stuff there that I have not been able to find anywhere else. You might find vertical files called subject files or actually morgue files in some archives. So look for those terms. These are a hodgepodge of loose documents that are filed by surname or subject name. Now the surname's easy. You can look in an index, find your surname. So what kind of subjects would be on that index? Well, things like names of churches, names of schools, names of local businesses, mercantiles, maybe even events that happened in the area. Literally, a file folder could be made for just about anything. And here's what they look like. This is some of our vertical files in the Houston County Archives and Museum. If you look closely, you'll see some surnames, you'll see some business names. Literally, honestly, if an archivist just has a few documents. Let's just say a newspaper clipping, a family group sheet, and a restaurant menu. And someone walks in and says, you want this, and they donate it, it's not going to go in a box on a shelf. It's just not enough. And so what do they do with it? They stick it in a file and put it in their vertical files. So this is why we need to be looking for these. These files are normally found in filing cabinets. Most likely, they're not going to be in the research area where you sit. They're going to be in back rooms where you can't see them. And so a lot of times I think genealogists, what they can't see, they don't know that's there, obviously, and they don't think to ask about what else is there. And so these are going to be in these back rooms. So you need to go on archives websites to see what records they have. When you're there visiting, talk to the archivist, the historical society member, wherever you're at, about what kind of records do they have. Do you have vertical files? And another thing I encourage genealogists to do is to get a tour of the facility. Now, don't show up on their doorstep and ask for a tour because you're not going to get one. You need to make an appointment. You need to plan ahead, let them know you're coming well in advance, and then get a tour of the facility. What's you going to get when you get that tour? You're going to get a tour of those back rooms, and you're going to see where the vertical files, filing cabinets are located. You're going to see all the shelves full of boxes. And when you're doing that, read the labels on the boxes. You'll get a much better sense of what records they have. This is actually an old photograph because we have more filing cabinets than this now. This is our vertical files in the Houston County, Tennessee Archives and Museum. One thing about vertical files is they grow as people donate things or as we find things in books, or in my case, I work for a county archive, so I get boxes of county government records. A lot of times there's stuff stuck in there that's very historical, and so we'll put it in a vertical file. So they grow. So it's why it's important that we always check back at these places where we do research to see what else they might have. Vertical files can contain just about anything that's been donated or found in the archives. So what can be in vertical files? I cannot tell you everything that's going to be in a vertical file. However, I'm going to share a few things with you. Newspaper clippings. There are a lot of newspaper clippings in vertical files. Now, there are some archives, some libraries that have what are called morgue files. Morgue files are filing cabinets filled to the brim with nothing but clipped obituaries, and they are usually organized by surname. So if you're looking for an obituary and that particular newspaper isn't microfilmed or digitized, maybe someone clipped it out of the paper and it's in a vertical file. So here's some examples. I've actually to me, to look at these are kind of funny because I know that these are very, very small newspaper clippings, but I've blown them up so they look kind of weird to be this big. But the one on the left is a golden wedding anniversary for Mr. and Mrs. Baggett. One thing you have to keep in mind about newspaper clippings is that you probably are not going to have the date of the newspaper or the name of the newspaper. So that's one of the things with newspaper clippings. I love the one down there on the bottom left. Emma Sykes, she was advertising her cleaning, pressing, and sewing work. And so that could be in the newspaper. And then this one over here on the right is an obituary. So he died on his 83rd birthday anniversary. So newspaper clippings can be in vertical files. Family group sheets, or what I call brief family histories, not those published hardbound family histories, but a lot of times you'll find some brief ones that are not that long, and they can be in vertical files as well. Here's an example of that. This is Edmund Herschel Cook's. This is his family group sheet. It was donated to archives, brought in by a genealogist, and I encourage genealogists to do that. Talk to the archivist, the historical society member, see if you can donate and have them put in those vertical files, because you're going to have researchers come behind you. And if they find your family group sheet, if you put your name on it and how you want to be contacted, you might get contacted and make a cousin connection and share all kinds of wonderful information. So you can find these in vertical files. Here's another different kind of group sheet or family tree for Edmund Herschel Cook. And this is located in the Cook surname vertical file. Now, is all this information on here true and accurate? Maybe not, but it's something we can use as a guideline. Business letterheads, invoices, and receipts. Now, I could put a lot of commas and list all kinds of wonderful things. Why would we want business letterheads, invoices, and receipts? Well, business letterheads, if your ancestors owned businesses in the area, but invoices and receipts, these are pieces of paper that normally would have been thrown away. But maybe there's an invoice or a receipt or something in that vertical file for your surname that would give you some clues to some questions that you have. Here is a couple of examples of that. This is the, oops, I need to go back there. This is some B.W. Hussey had a grocery store. And you can see there, this is just something for his business letterhead. This was to Mr. J.M. Boone. And then the Bank of Erin on there on the right. This one I think is pretty interesting. This is something that you would have to look in the Bank of Erin vertical file to find. These are the lists of notes that were left at the bank for collection as of 1898. And they list each individual person and how much they owed. Now, how would you know that your ancestor was on this piece of paper? That would be difficult because most vertical files have an index with the surname and subject name, but they don't index every single piece of paper that's in every single file. And so, yeah, that one would be difficult to find, but it's out there. Photographs. I can tell you that a lot of photographs can be found in vertical files, but I can also tell you that I have seen many archivists take all of their photographs, no matter what collection they're in, call them all together and put them in one photograph collection. So it all depends on the archives and the archivist and how they decided to do it. But I have found pictures of my ancestors in vertical files. And here's a couple of good ones from our vertical files. The one there at the top left has no names on the back of it. We don't know who they are. We just know that they are in our local area. And the one on the bottom is actually a wedding photograph. Mr. and Mrs. Adams got married and looks like they went to the ice cream parlor. So you never know what you're going to find. The photograph on the top left is an original photograph. The one on the bottom right is actually a copy of a photograph. So you may find original photographs or copies, but hey, it's a photograph. Donated documents and ephemera. If you don't know what ephemera is, that's a fancy term for stuff that people should have thrown away or should have gotten thrown away. These are records, documents, and things that were produced at a particular time for a particular purpose. And when that was done and over with, it usually got thrown away. So this kind of stuff is also in vertical files. So here is some original examples. These are the Sparkman Burial Association application for membership, dated 1933. This is for husband and wife. And the family actually donated these two. They came into the archives with just these two documents and wanted to donate them because they knew that we were looking for records for the local funeral homes and burial associations. So they brought them in. And we have these now in the Stanfill surname file. I love this one. This is an actual school teacher license for Miss Gertha Brooks. She was a well-known educator in our area for decades. And this is her actual license, dated from 1919. Now you can't read it, but I'm going to read it underneath her name. It says, this certifies that Gertha Brooks is a person of good moral character who does not use intoxicants, opiates, or cigarettes, and having passed the examination required by law, entitled to such in the elementary schools. I love that does not use intoxicants, opiates, or cigarettes. And so this is fantastic. Next is manuscript collection. So vertical files, put that on your to-do list. Look at the great records that I just showed you. And that's just a very, very small piece of what can be found. So we're next going to talk about manuscript collections. Now, I'm extremely passionate about manuscript collections because when I started as an archivist, I found genealogists never asked about them. They either didn't know about them. If they did know about them, they weren't sure how to handle them, what to do with them. And some of them are kind of intimidated. And I kind of blame a little bit of that on the archives profession, the archives world, because we don't do a very good job of educating the community, the genealogists, researchers about what they are. And we also kind of, over the years, have drawn a veil over archives. It's like we want to keep everything secret, you know, and I just, since in 2015, I decided that I was going to start speaking and teaching and writing about archives because I just knew that there was so much that genealogists needed to know. So manuscript collection. So I'm going to describe to you what these are in layman's terms so you can understand it. I want you to think about all of the genealogical records you have in your possession that are yours, whether that is old family letters, you have scrapbooks or diaries. Maybe you have the quilt that your grandmother made or your mom's wedding dress, or maybe you have a lock of hair from one of your family members. Box all that up and take it down to the archives and donate it. That is a manuscript collection. And so you can truly understand that literally anything and everything can be in a manuscript collection. I really, really do think that the manuscript collection is one of the most underused records collections by genealogists. Um, and I'll tell you this, also in Canada and in Europe, manuscript collections are called FONDS collections, FONDS. So if you're researching in Canada or in Europe, they're not going to be called manuscript collections, they're going to be called FONDS collections. Here is an example of a manuscript collections before an archivist got hold of it. This is belonged to Miss Nina Finley. Miss Nina Finley was our local county historian for decades. She was also a local educator. And she passed away in 2014. And her son called us at the archives and asked if we would like to have her research records out of her attic as they were cleaning out her house. And I knew about these records only because Miss Finley had told me that she had them there, that one day she would bring them down to the archives and donate them. And she didn't get a chance to. So luckily, her son knew the importance of saving and preserving them. So what I didn't know was that it would take a couple of truckloads to actually get them all to us. And so I call this fresh from the attic. They're still in their original boxes. We have since reboxed everything into archival boxes. We've cataloged everything, and now it's ready for researchers. But this is what it looks like when it gets to us most of the time. I mean, I've had records donated to us in garbage bags. I've had records donated to us in all kinds of manner. But you see here, though, none of this is online, none of this is microfilmed, none of this is digitized. It is all records that any genealogist would love to get their hands on. So a manuscript collection, when it's ready for researchers, is an organized collection of records. They're housed in file folders and in boxes. This is what a processed, ready for researchers collection looks like. As you can see, it's in nice, wonderful boxes. It's very organized, and it's ready for researchers. This is not bound volumes that you see there in the middle. Those are actually like scrapbook type, they're archival scrapbook type things, and they have newspapers, whole newspapers in them. This is actually our Irish Celebration Records collection. We have an Irish celebration here in our county every year. We've had one every year since 1963. It's to kind of commemorate the Irish railroad workers who built the railroad through here, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad in the 1850s. So we have a celebration every year. Well, we've been collecting documents and programs and photographs and newspaper clippings pertaining to that celebration. And we have a whole collection. But family papers are done this way. Business records, civic club records, social club records, whatever it is, if it's a collection of records and the archives keeps it and archives it, will look like this. So the materials that are going to be in a manuscript collection are about 99.9% donated by original individuals, businesses, and all kinds of organizations. I mentioned civic clubs, and social clubs, because many of these clubs, if you are a part of these kinds of clubs, and especially if you've been an officer in one of them, if you've become a secretary and then they hand you a box, 2 boxes, maybe 3 boxes of the old club's records, because now you're the secretary and it's up to you to keep up with it. Well, there comes a point in time where they get to one secretary or one treasurer or one president, and they decide they're not going to house these in their home, or they don't have room in their home. So they start looking for a place for them to be archived. And this is how they get to our archives. This is a sad story, but I try to share it every once in a while in my presentations. A few years ago now, of course, everything is before COVID or after COVID. So I think this is before COVID. I had a couple of sisters walk into my archives and they were carrying 2 boxes. This is just a picture of one box. The other box looked just like this one with a bunch of binders in it. And they told me that that they were on their way to the landfill or the dump to throw these away, but that someone told them to come by the archives and see if I wanted them. And so I said, "Well, what do you have?" And they said, "Well, our mother is in the nursing home and we're cleaning out her house. And we found these things, these binders, and we don't want them. And so we were going to throw them away. And some people thought you might want them." So I started looking at them, and I don't know if you can tell, but there are surnames on a lot of the bindings of these 3-ring binders. Once I looked through some of these, I figured out that it was about 50 years worth of their mother's genealogy research. Yes, it's their daughters. They didn't want nothing to do with it. This is what happens to a lot of genealogy material. So I looked closer and closer at the records, and I figured out that they have absolutely nothing to do with Houston County, Tennessee, where I'm the archivist. And in fact, they had absolutely nothing to do with the state of Tennessee. Majority of these surnames came from states up north. So then I had a decision to make, because one of the things that archivists usually don't do is we don't accept records for the most part, records that have nothing to do with where our archives is located. But I also knew, I could hear it in my mind, that these 2 girls were going to take these 2 boxes of records straight to the dump and throw them away if I didn't take them. So my genealogy brain kicked in and I said, okay, I'll take them. So we have these in our archives. I have since tried to find other archives where these surnames are from to send them to. I've had no luck yet because many of our archives are full. And so, but inside these volumes, there are original photographs, original documents, and fantastic genealogy. I wish I could have met this woman and talked to her, because she did some fantastic genealogy work. But this is what we deal with almost on a daily basis in the archives, stuff that people don't want. So part of the manuscript collection that you really, really need to know about is the finding aid. What is the finding aid? It's, I think, other than the records, it's the most important part of a manuscript collection. But the finding aid is a document that is produced by the archivist, the historical society member, whoever is processing the collection. And it is a file by folder, box by box listing of what is in each collection. Now, there's a lot more to a finding aid. I would encourage you to read the entire finding aid. There's a lot of great information in finding aids, but this is going to be your roadmap. This is going to help you to understand what is in a particular collection. Now, manuscript collections are for the most part not digitized and not online. However, many archives have put their finding aids online. So that means that you can sit in your fuzzy slippers and your jammies at 3 o'clock in the morning and read these finding aids, make your notes of what records you want to get copies of, or you want to look at, or you want to know more about. And then you can, the next day, you can email, telephone, or even visit, if you can, the archives and look at these records. So the finding aids may be on their website. And I encourage you to dig when you get onto an archives website. I can say this because I'm an archivist, but archivists just don't make it easy for you to find things on their website. So dig, you've got to dig and click, and even email them, ask them, do you have an index of your finding aids? Are your finding aids online? But you need to read the finding aids. The contents listing is the part where you're going to see the box by box, folder by folder listing of what's in the collection. So here's a brief example. I actually do a whole presentation on manuscript collections and finding aids. So here is a brief example of the finding aid. This is the Marie Stockard Estate Collection. And part of the finding aid is down there, folder 7, 8, and 9. And these are all correspondence. So they're full of old letters. Now, again, my genealogy brain kicks in when I do finding aids. I list everything that's in the folders in my finding aids. I have the luxury of being able to take the time to do that in my archive. So this is actually not what you would see 100% in a finding aid. Most likely what you would see in a regular finding aid is just the folder number and then correspondence 1925, correspondence 1927, correspondence 1940. Most archives and archivists do not list every single thing that's in the folder. They just don't. It's actually how we were taught to do it. But again, my genealogy brain kicks in sometimes, and I want genealogists to see what's in the collections. Again, very, very few are microfilmed, very, very few, even more fewer, are digitized and online. It's sad, but again, it takes manpower to do this. And we don't feed things through a scanner. We have to do them one page at a time, and that can be very time consuming. And so they just don't digitize this. This is not at the top of their list to get digitized. So here are some Bateman family records collection. I'm going to show you some examples of manuscript collections. This is how it looks before we processed it. These records were in very, very bad condition. Mr. Bateman's house had actually gone through a house fire. These particular records, some of them were actually singed, but for the most part had been saved. And I could tell that they weren't really that well taken care of before the house fire. But there's fantastic records in here. This particular document was very interesting. Mr. Bateman, his records had this in there. We have a gentleman who is one of our county historians. His name is Donald Bateman. He was looking through these records one day, and I was showing him this particular document. It's an envelope that had some sort of glue or paste or something that had gotten on it, and it was glued to something else. And so my instinct, because I looked at this envelope and I thought, this envelope doesn't hold any kind of anything for our archives, I was going to toss it because it had gotten glue on it. And so I showed it. He was looking through there and I showed him, I told him what I was going to do. And he says, wait a minute, let me look at it. So his grandmother was Grandma Myrtle Bateman. And he got to looking at this envelope and something just jumped off of this envelope at him. You can hardly see it, but she had used this envelope to do some ciphering, as they say. This was dated, let me see if I can, 1931. And this is during the Great Depression. Donald Bateman knew that during this time, his grandmother, Myrtle Bateman, had purchased property, the adjoining farm, to hers because her husband had passed away and she was raising her children and running the farm all by herself during the Depression. And he had already researched her and researched this purchase. So he saw this number that she had added up on this envelope, $3,250.21. He knew exactly what that number was for. That was the number that she had decided that she was going to pay for the property. And the reason why that number meant something to him was because he read the number in the deed. And the number was the exact number that she had paid for the property. So yes, I kept the envelope and I was able to add that story to the envelope. So something so insignificant as someone's jotting down a number is something that even one genealogist was very grateful to have. So that's manuscript collections. Next are loose marriage records. Many of us have actually done research in those bound marriage records. Did you know that there could be other documentation for those marriages? There could be. So these would be additional paperwork or accompanying paperwork that go with the marriage and related to that marriage event. Again, they're going to be archived separately. They're not going to be stuck in the book or with the bound book. So when you're working with an archive and you find something in the bound volumes, then you need to turn around and say, okay, do you have any other loose marriage records or any marriage records that are archived separately from the bound volumes? What can be in these loose marriage records? There could be affidavits, parents' permission letters to give their children permission to get married, marriage bonds. I'm going to show you in a minute an extra copy of the marriage certificate. Also, blood test results. Back in the day when we had to take blood tests to get married, and the blood test results can be in there. And these are all things that are in my loose marriage records in the archives where I work. Almost none, well, I'll say almost none. Very few of these are microfilm digitized or online. I have seen some places in Tennessee, some of the larger cities that have some of these have microfilm them, or I have seen them on Family Search, but only one or two places. These loose records are just not on the top of the list to get digitized. So here is a marriage blood test. Now I have redacted the names because in the state of Tennessee, medical records are considered closed to the public. Now, the state of Tennessee is considered a sunshine state, which means all of our records are open to the public. However, there are three known record sets that are not open to the public: medical records, juvenile records, and adoption records. I don't care how old those records are. I have adoption records going back to the 1800s. I have to put them in a box, in a vault, and under lock and key. No one can see them unless you have a court order. So those three things, anything else is open to the public. So enable for me to share this with you, I have to redact the names. So this is an actual results of the blood test. Here is a copy of the license. When I received these records from the county court clerk to process them, I thought to myself, because almost all of them had a marriage license in it, and it looked like it was really thick, nice certificate paper. And I thought, why did they give the marriage couple their marriage license? And so I talked to the county clerk, who is still there today, and he's been there since the 1970s. He said, oh, we would just make an extra copy. And he would have it notarized and everything. And so that's fine by me. So there's an extra copy in every file. Loose probate records. Now, these loose records are probably the one record source, the one loose record source that genealogists probably know the most about. You may not know them as loose, but probate records, probate packets are ones that you probably have worked with more than any of the ones that I've talked about. So what are these? These are additional or accompanying paperwork related to the probate of an estate of the deceased. This is in addition to whatever you might find in a bound volume. And here's an example of that. Again, this is not the bound volume. This is extra paperwork. And this is honestly where you're going to find the good stuff. This is what I say. This is where you're going to find the rest of the story. This is William Pulley from 1959. This is his probate file. What are you going to find in a probate file? Well, literally anything, but there are receipts, invoices, affidavits. There could be some additional paperwork, especially if you have family members fighting over the estate. Then it gets juicy. So this is where you're going to find all of this. None of this is in the bound volume. In fact, none of this is even referenced in the bound volume. So that's why I'm telling you, if you find information in a bound volume of any kind, you need to investigate whether there are additional paperwork. Here is one from my own family, or my own research, actually. This is my husband's family. This poor dilapidated envelope is from Jesse Glasgow. To this date, we still don't know why this envelope exists and the contents that were in the envelope. We have come to the conclusion that most likely, 95% we've decided, it was from his probate, but it wasn't filed or with probate records. It was actually found in a box with a bunch of other stuff that had nothing to do with each other at the Stewart County Archives, which is the county next to me here in Tennessee. So what does it say on the envelope? It says at the top, it says deeds. And then underneath there, it says died March 1892. Well, Jesse Glasgow did die March the 31st, 1892. Jesse Glasgow is my husband's third great grandfather. I have been researching him for 34 years. He is, okay, I'll admit it, he's one of my favorite ancestors to research. I don't know if you have favorites, but I do. He's one of my favorites. So when I was at the Archives Institute going back to school to become an archivist, I was in class, and the lady next to me who was becoming an archivist was the archivist for the Stewart County Archives. She raised her hand one day in class and asked a question. She said, we have this collection of records that we don't know how to archive. So she proceeded to talk about the records, and then she dropped the name Jesse Glasgow, and I just about literally fell out of my chair. So after class, I asked her, I said, what do you have? When you get back there, please scan everything and send it to me. So she did. Some about 60 to 70 individual original records were in this envelope. I'm going to show you a couple of those records, but I want to fast forward to just a few years ago. The lady that I talked to actually had passed away, and her son took over at the archives. And he and I are really good friends. Well, he contacted me just a few years ago and said, you know, Melissa, we still have this packet of documents that we just don't know what to do with. We here at the archives have decided that you're the only person researching this family that we know of, especially this person. So we're just going to give you all these records. He handed over to me all of the original records. I was shocked because there are some fantastic records. So one of those records, actually the probate records are going to be, again, separate from the will books. You might find the last will and testament in a book, a bound volume, or you may find probate information in a probate bound volume, but there's most likely going to be other paperwork in the loose records. So here's a couple of records that we found in that envelope from Jesse Glasgow. This one's dated September 29th, 1886. It's a simple receipt. It's a piece of ephemera, something that probably would have gotten thrown away years ago, but it didn't. And the photographer is E. E. Collison Jr., who was a very well-known photographer in our area. He is purchasing a photograph. Interestingly enough, we have no photograph of Jesse Glasgow. None that we have found that have surfaced. We do have a photograph for his grandson, Dr. William Henry Glasgow. That could be the photograph he's paying for, but I think it's very intriguing. We don't have any photographs of Jesse, but here he is paying for a photograph. What are in loose probate records? Oh, I love probate files. They can have all kinds of wonderful things in them. But there could be affidavits, correspondence, invoices, receipts. There could be testimonies in there by family members who are fighting over the estate. If you're kind of lucky enough to get a hold of a probate case file where the family members are fighting over the estate, it can be very thick and it can be very interesting to read. Here are a couple of more documents out of that packet of information that envelope that I showed you. These actually are ones that I was able to understand. There are two invoices. I kind of scanned them together, but one on the left is for Jesse Glasgow. It's at a local general merchandise store. He's buying basic day-to-day things. He's buying 2 pairs of pants, 30 pounds of bacon, a pair of shoes. But if you look at the one on the right, this one is quite interesting. It is for Notley Harris. Now, Notley Harris is Jesse Glasgow's son-in-law. And of course, these are dated September of 1887. If you look at what Notley Harris is purchasing, it's quite different. He is purchasing 3 coffins. These 3 coffins are for his wife, who is Jesse Glasgow's daughter, and their 2 children who had passed away. So this is a very significant invoice or receipt, and I was kind of glad to find it. I already knew about the deaths, but it just adds to that documentation. Many of our probate records are not microfilm digitized or online. However, more and more of these are becoming online. The books definitely are, but the loose probate files, again, take time to digitize. And so there's not as many online, but there are more of the probate loose records online than any of the other loose collections that I've talked about. Oh, this is the last document out of that Jesse Glasgow packet. It's a Louisiana state lottery ticket, believe it or not. Jesse Glasgow lived his entire life in the state of Tennessee. I learned by researching in newspapers that the Louisiana State Lottery actually advertised in the newspapers across the country, actually. And you could go right down to your post office and pay for your Louisiana State Lottery ticket and get, this is the receipt for that, dated June the 9th, 1888. At the bottom of that page there, it gives his lottery number. They actually published the winning lottery numbers. I've yet to find that he won, but very interesting. I mean, who else knows that their ancestor purchased a lottery ticket? So great records. The other loose records I want to talk about are court records. Now, these are very prevalent. They're very prevalent in most archives and most court systems. If the court records are still located at the courthouse with the courts, these are very prevalent. They may be called loose records, loose court packets. Again, these are records that are separate from the bound volume. So if you look at a circuit court, general sessions, chancery court, any kind of a court bound volume, and you find a case in there for your ancestor, that's not the rest of the story. What you find in there is just a brief synopsis, a little bit about the case. You need to find the loose records to go with it. And here is an example of that. This is a case from 1952. This is one that I processed a few years ago. William Hughes was being sued by the state of Tennessee. It was a criminal case. And he was being brought up on charges of going armed with a razor. Now, I can remember very distinctly, you'll see why in a minute, processing this collection. Now, these documents were tri-folded and stuck in that envelope down there to the left. And so as we process records, we reach in, grab out the documents, we flatten them. make sure they don't need to be cleaned or any metal taken off, and then we put them in file folders. Well, on this particular day, when I pulled these out, I did that, and then I realized there was still something in that packet. Well, I reached down in there and I pulled out the razor. You see it there in the photograph. The razor was in that packet. I am so glad that it was closed because that razor today is extremely sharp. And so we were able to find an artifact. But this stuff here, these subpoenas, these affidavits, the razor, all kinds of things like this, you don't see this or hear this in the bound volumes. This is the good stuff that is in those loose records. Again, like all the other loose records I've talked about, they're archived separately. You really need to talk to the archivist or whomever at the courthouse. Say, if you find something in the bound volumes, ask them, do you have any court packets, loose records, additional documentation about this case? Here's an example of that. These are some loose court records that we actually found inside one of the bound volumes. I tell you, people love to stick things in books. We were able to find out which case all these documents went to and put them in their folders. But all of these things are not online. They are not in the bound volumes as far as recorded in the bound volumes. That's why it's important we look for these records. These loose records are going to have these additional information, a lot more information pertaining to the court case that you find in the bound volumes. What you find in those bound volumes is very, very little compared to what you can find in the loose files. And so an example, this is an exhibit. This is a court exhibit. This is a drawing of part of our downtown. There was a boundary dispute, a deed dispute going on in this particular case. And so what did they do? They drew part of our downtown. And this is dated back into the 1950s, I believe. So for me as an archivist, this was fantastic to find because not only do I help genealogists and I help with family history, but I'm also huge in documenting our local history. And so this was a fantastic find to find in a court record. These kinds of records are considered working papers or accompanying papers. They could be affidavits, subpoenas, witness statements. There could be actually be photographic evidence in these court records. I've seen all kinds of wonderful things in court records. Here is an example. There was a court case between a couple of landowners about some land. Well, on that land was a cemetery, the McIntosh Cemetery. And so that became part of the court case. So within this court file was the listing of who's buried there. This is just the first page. I didn't scan all the pages with writing on it. And so here is this listing of cemetery, people who are buried in a cemetery in a court file. Like I said, you just don't know what you're going to find in some of these court files. Again, these, for the most part, are not microfilm digitized or online. I'm finding that I'm starting to see a few of these come online, but for the most part, they're not. So that's just a few of the loose records. There's really a few more out there that I could talk about, but we don't have time. So how do we are going to find these loose records? They're always going to be stored in those back rooms where you can't see them, in the stacks, as we call them. So you need to develop relationships with the archivist, with the librarian, with the historical society member, wherever you're working with. Develop relationships, emailing them, calling them, talking to them about their records. Here is a photograph I took at the Dickson County, Tennessee Archives. The books on the way far wall that you see there in the back, all those books are digitized. They're on Family Search. But everything you see on the shelves is manuscript collections, loose court records, loose marriage records that are not online anywhere. And so they're in these boxes and they're fantastic records. So talk to the archivist, clerk, or librarian about their loose records. They're going to know exactly what you're talking about, especially if you're in a court case and you say, do you have anything additional to go with this court case? Any loose records, any loose packets? They're going to know what you're talking about. Here is an example of a manuscript collection. This is the Lyle Family Records collection that was donated to us a few years ago. Just like I explained what a manuscript collection was, a little bit of everything. They owned a store in our area, so there's a store ledger. There are scrapbooks, there are newspaper clippings, there's photographs, there's receipts, invoices, all kinds of wonderful things. And it isn't all about the Lyle family. The ledger book from their store has accounts in them from people who had purchased from them. And a lot of the newspaper clippings have to do with other people other than their family. Check online websites, archive websites. They may have some things indexed. They may have their finding aids digitized online. And they maybe might have some of their loose records digitized online if they're small collections. I find some archives will do some small collections, but not necessarily the larger collections. And you need to look for things like this. This is actually from the Tennessee State Library and Archives. This is the Archives Development page. This is Shelby County. This is where Memphis is located. If you want to know where Shelby County is, where Memphis is located. They have a listing of their physical holdings. And if you'll look there in the listing, it says probate court loose papers from 1820 to 1900. So maybe in their listings of what the records they have, you might have the loose records listed. Here is another example. This is the Robertson County, Tennessee. This is where Springfield, Tennessee is located. This is their microfilm list. This is what they have on microfilm. And so you see their loose records project from their Chancery Court. Chancery Court is where you would have divorces, where you would have probates and other civil cases. And so going back to 1844, and they're microfilmed. So that's, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe these are also on Family Search. So very few do have them microfilmed and digitized, but not a lot. So contact and visit those archives. Sometimes the only way to know what they have is to communicate with them, to talk to them, to ask them. Now, don't contact them and say, I'm researching the Smith family and I want to know everything you have on the Smith family, because it's going to fall on deaf ears. You're not going to get anything. But be specific. Ask them about their records. They may point you to a place on their website that lists what records they have. And so you need to really get a good sense of what records they have. This is actually a photograph of the Tennessee State Library and Archives, the old building. We have a new building now. And people would not ever know driving by this building that on the top floor was where they stored the majority of the Tennessee Supreme Court records. I had the privilege of actually touring the facility when I was going back to school to become an archivist here. I got to work on those Tennessee Supreme Court records during class. And so when you get on the elevator and you go to this top floor, when you step off the elevator, as far as your eye can see is nothing but shelves full of boxes of the Tennessee Supreme Court records dating back to 1796. They have so many Supreme Court records that they have a whole another building that's full of them as well. So I'm telling you, these records are out there. We just have to go find them. I walked through this photograph in. The red arrow there at the top left those are my hands. We're actually working on Supreme Court records back when I was going to school. I can't remember who took the picture, but I know those are my hands. And we were working on cleaning them. We were getting them ready for researchers. So these loose records can be a true goldmine for you as a genealogist. They can fill in the gaps of missing information that you can't find in any other record source. If you have a brick wall, I don't like to say I have brick walls. I have genealogy challenges, but it may help you tear down that brick wall and put these records on your to-do list. If you're going to visit an archive, if you're going to visit their website or contact them in any way, put them on your to-do list and ask about them. Thank you so much for attending this presentation. Please visit my blog, Genealogist in the Archives. And you can also find me on Facebook, The Archive Lady. And please email me if you've got any questions about this presentation or researching in archives or actually records preservation. Please reach out to me. I love to hear from those who's attended my presentations. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Janice to see if we have any questions.
Oh, well, we definitely have questions. Some of them I've been answering